Okay, so we're back on this slide from the last recording. So the aerial war, it's going to start. This is like the start of the war. So they're going to start at 12 noon. And the reason they're going to start at 12 noon is because the Iraqi pilots are not very well seasoned and they don't have the equipment to be able to fly during the night. So they don't have the radar or the night vision goggles or anything like that. So in order to be able to see the targets, they have to go in the middle of the day. And although it was supposed to be very coordinated, it really wasn't. So they were given some targets, but there was some clear lack of planning, and they didn't really do a very good job. So they're instructed to bomb the runways. And the funny thing is that there are aircraft that are sitting right next to the runways. So they bomb the runways. Whoop-de-doo. The runways are repaired by that evening, and the Iranians are already counterattacking by the next day and the next morning. So it was like really dumb when you could very easily, knock out airplanes and you knock out the road or the runway. So, like I said, the Iranians they counterattack the next day. They inflict more damage, and the reason is that the Iranians they had professional pilots. They had pilots that had trained in military academies in Europe, military academies in the United States, and they knew how to fly. Plus, they had airplanes that were significantly better. They had U.S. F-14s versus these Iraqi MiGs that we're going to see here in a minute. So they were able to attack with much more vigor, and they were much more effective. So here's what we're talking about, as mentioned a second ago. So the Iraqis they're on the left. So they have these Soviet-made MiGs. Sometimes they have a few French Mirage F1s, which are pretty good airplanes. But for the most part, they're stuck with these secondhand models. They're not giving like the cream of the crop as far as the technology, because the Soviets they're not about to sell the Iraqis the top of the line equipment. The Iranians, on the other hand, they have better equipment, so they're flying F-14s that they bought from the United States while the Reza Shah was in power, because he was friendly with the United States and they were willing to help provide them and help save off the Soviet influence in the region as like kind of the counterbalance. However, as we mentioned during the Islamic Revolution, they start killing off all these pilots. So all the people that know how to fly these very complex aircraft have been thrown in jail. So they don't have as many pilots as they normally would have. Additionally, they don't have the people that can service the airplanes. So they don't have, they've taken all these U.S. Technicians and maintenance people that could fix these airplanes, and they've completely alienated the United States because they've put all these embassy workers and they've taken them hostage. So the United States isn't about to send maintenance people to go help fix these airplanes. So even though Iran has better airplanes and they have the ability, better capabilities, they're set. They're limited. They're limited to what they had in 1979 before the Islamic Revolution. If they didn't have it beforehand, then they're stuck. Moving on to the early ground war. So in September of 1980, Iraq, they're going to launch 6 very uncoordinated attacks. So this is, a couple days after the original air war. So they're thinking, hey, we're going to do what we can to completely, influence and infiltrate Iran. So this is going to catch the Iranians kind of by surprise, because the Iranians haven't sent troops to the border region. They only have kind of that basic police units that any country will have at their border. So they're stuck with just some policemen, but not really any military troops, because they're protecting the prize, Tehran. What the Iraqis did is they sent tanks. We talked about the middle of the country being very desert. So they send a bunch of tanks through, but they don't have infantry to help support. So this just makes it such that the Iranians, when they get their airplanes up, it's very easy to just bomb these tanks because there's no one to help fight back, because the tanks are very limited. They're not very mobile. They're not agile. So they're very easy targets for the Iranians. And additionally, the Iraqis, it's very easy to push forward when nobody's shooting back at you. But once the Iranians, they start fighting back, the Iraqis, they take cover, and they're not going to advance nearly as quick as someone that has experience. So even though the Iraqis, they make some good gains, um, they were very lucky that they didn't have very much resistance, because the more resistance that they had, the more likely that they weren't really going to go very far, because they're not ready to take that next step of responding to fighting back. The early ground war continued. So the Iraqis, they want to be liberators in Khuzestan. So we've talked about Khuzestan being an area where there are Arabs, and they want to kind of do the same thing that the Iranians were doing in the southeastern part of Iraq, with the Shias. So they wanted to be the liberators. However, they made like the stupid mistake, like absolutely horrible, is they started to execute the Arabs in the region. They say, "Oh, you're a traitor. You're for Iran. How could you possibly be doing this?" And this news spreads very quickly. When you start executing people of the same race, they're not going to see you as a liberator. They see you as a conqueror, and that's just not going to work with this strategy. So the Iraqis, their goal was they're going to take the cities. So they're going to go get Kazakhstan, which is a city in this region, but they're not going to take the road. So they're not going to prevent the Iranians from being able to get back to these cities. So it would have been very smart of them if they destroyed the road leading into the city and then take the city, because then it would not allow for counterattacks. But they struggled with this, and it allowed the Iranians to be able to get back in and counterattack and be able to recapture the city that the Iraqis were able to take. And this just very clearly showed a lot of incompetent leadership, that nobody was willing to do what it took to really improve the situation, to really take control of the western part of Iran. So within a week of the war starting, the United Nations Security Council, they're going to draw up a ceasefire. They're saying, "Hey, we don't really like you guys fighting. You're in a very tumultuous area. You have a lot of oil. We don't really want you guys to be fighting." However, Iran is going to reject this, and this is coming out of total hubris or pride from the Ayatollah Khamenei. He says, Iran, we were attacked, and we're not going to stop fighting until the Iraqis are removing Saddam Hussein, because he kind of takes this as an opportunity to spread his Islamic revolution, because he does not want Saddam Hussein to be in power, and he would rather have someone that's more radical, more ideological. So Saddam, he's actually kind of happy about this, because he thinks that this gives him the moral high ground of saying, "Hey, the Ayatollah Khomeini rejected it. He wants to remove me from power. Let's keep fighting." And because of this, the war is going to keep fighting, and nobody's really going to, both sides, they're very prideful. Additionally, Saddam thinks that he needs an actual military victory, which he doesn't have yet. This first week of fighting, he doesn't really take control. So he thinks that he needs like the actual military victory. He needs to actually conquer territory to advance. A couple of other notes before we pause and move it on and do another recording is that the Iraqi infantry is actually going to be better than the Iranian infantry. So this is especially with the Pastaran, which, if you guys remember, they're kind of they're not trained, and they're just, sometimes given a gun to go clear a minefield. So the Iraqi infantry is better. However, the commanders or the command structure is very poor. The officers are horrible. The troops are not very disciplined. They're allowed to loot the towns whenever they conquer them. So an example of Kormashar is that once they take over, it's like the spoils of the war. They're allowed to steal watches, that kind of stuff. A loyalty to the regime is a prerequisite for promotion. So you only get promoted if you're loyal, not if you're like a good officer. And By winter, the Iraqis, they're able to advance far enough that they can have defensive positions, but they're also